Welcome to the Coach Debbie Potts Show, where high performers learn how to stop guessing and start aging stronger, not slower. Your host is Coach Debbie Potts, functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, metabolic health coach, and host of this show. Here, we dive into the why behind fatigue, stubborn weight, hormone chaos, gut issues, and declining performance. Using real data, functional lab testing, metabolism analysis, and simple daily habits that actually move the needle. Whether you're an endurance athlete, an executive, or simply committed to becoming your strongest future you're in the right place. Let's get started.
All right, guys, I've got my friend Martha Carlin on the show to talk about her new book. Martha, welcome to the podcast once again.
Thanks so much for having me back, Debbie.
Well, we've done many rabbit hole episodes the last couple of years, and now I'm happy to say I get to interview you based on your book, Connected, that came out. I must say, I never read very fast, but this book I read fast. I got very into it because of your story. And I think just meeting you in person last year, becoming friends, podcasting, this is a good way to get people to know your whole life.
Yes.
Timeline.
It is.
I don't think we'd ever cover all of this in conversations that we have because we just kind of go all different areas. But I'm excited to share this book. I just have one last chapter to read, but this book really brings to light how important it is to do root cause effect, look at the timeline, how everything integrates together, and just everything I've talked about in the show, partially because of you and Dr. William Davis and looking at the root cause of everything. Why does that happen? Why does that happen? So before we dive into your book, tell me what's your why purpose to write this and how you're feeling about it.
So the book chronicles my 24-year journey of looking for answers to Parkinson's. My husband, John, was diagnosed at a very young age. He was 44. And John passed away from a pulmonary embolism after suffering some pretty severe long COVID symptoms in 2024. And John and I had talked about writing a book together to sort of share our parallel stories in Parkinson's, and we never got to that. So part of it, I wanted to honor as much as I could of, John's own story and his resilience, and the fact that, a Parkinson's diagnosis does not mean your life is over. And, John had an incredibly adventurous life, and I did too with him after that diagnosis. So part of it is I just wanted to share with people hope that there is, there's many different paths. You don't have to kind of pick up that diagnosis and go sit on the couch and wait to die. You can have a full and vibrant life, which we did. I also wanted people to understand my journey in looking for root cause and coming to see how all the pieces fit together, and that our life story is a very important piece of that puzzle, and how important stressors are, emotional and traumatic events that can have an impact on, they say the issues are in the tissues. We hold things in our body. So I talk quite a bit about that, learning about that, the spiritual aspects of dis-ease, or, feeling that we're unworthy. These are all aspects of chronic disease, not just Parkinson's, that are rarely spoken about. And so I wanted people to see and understand how those components of stress come into play. And then, the myriad environmental factors that can contribute to many, not just Parkinson's, but all of these different chronic issues we're dealing with, and whether that's antibiotics or herbicide pesticide exposure, or, in the case of Parkinson's, dry cleaning fluid, all of the little pieces that came into play in looking at other people's research and looking at John's life and understanding that. So I put it all together partly to tell that story so other people could start to connect the dots. And then for me personally, it was also pretty cathartic to write it and get it down on paper.
That's what I thought too. I mean, I remember when we first podcasted and we missed the appointment and you said, my husband just passed away. I was like, well, why are we
Yeah.
even scheduling a podcast? It just suddenly happened as we find out in the story, but it is what I thought writing this and just you wrote it. How long did it take you to write it?
Actually, not that. So I started last November and I finished it in March. And the way that I wrote it, actually, I used the voice recorder on my iPhone. I walk about 3 miles every morning on my farm. And except for the days when it was raining and I couldn't do that, I was out doing a 3 mile walk, just like telling the stories of the things I wanted people to understand. Uh, and I didn't even do that in chronological order. Now, in the book, I say at the beginning, some of it's in chronological order, but some of it is not. And that's partly because the pieces came together, not necessarily in chronological order. And um, I think that's also important for us to understand that as we revisit things, we get new insights. And, that's not always in chronological order.
Well, I think it's pretty powerful reading the story, the timeline of the events. And I don't want to give it away too much information because I want people to read the book.
Yeah.
But I find it how is it interesting it is to go back in time. And I did this with my own book, Life is Not Erased. It's totally, adrenal exhaustion stuff isn't the same, but how I had to go back. Why did it happen to me and not other people? And this is a lot more serious chronic disease versus stress disease. But how interesting it is to go back into time and how watching or reading how your mind went back and look at all these clues that I can see how it's not exactly in order because you'll go back and go, oh, now I get that. And you research, you met so many different people around the world. Kind of tell me how that felt for you going back in time, sharing that or diving into it again, writing this book.
Well, I mean, there's one chapter in particular that was a new epiphany for me writing the book. I knew that John had sensitivity to blue light, um, but it was really only severe after having had COVID. Um, and I also, so in December of 2022, and I don't think we actually got together in San Diego then, I can't remember, but I was out there, we were out there visiting our daughter for Christmas. Her husband was deployed, and so we went out there and we went to dinner at the Hotel Del Coronado, and there's this like corridor, like when you park far away, there's this corridor that I can't remember if it's actually open to the air or it just has this light coming through it from above, but it's a very like between two buildings. And the time of day that we got there, it had this very strange quality of light that actually reminded me of the quality of light when John and I went and saw the eclipse. And John really struggled to walk through that corridor to dinner. And so I was trying to understand that as I was writing the book about that and the connection to John having trouble with blue light. When we would go into Costco, like he couldn't go into a Costco store. He got so sensitive to the light. And, most people, if you've been to a Costco store, it is a lighting assault on your senses. And, you walk in and it's just whoo, and crossing the threshold, he could not move. And then we would turn him around and he would see the outside light and he could walk back out to the car and I would finish shopping. And in the process of that, this scientist that I have been working with for the last 4 years, looking to understand the physical chemistry of what's going on in Parkinson's, I sent him the chapter. So I had all this information about John and his sensitivity to light. And then I had this information from a Parkinson's support group of wives of men with Parkinson's who had this observation that all of their husbands had prism glasses, and prism glasses changed the refraction of the light. And I sent the chapter to Dr. Nenham. He's a physicist by, his undergraduate training, and then he's a colloid surface chemist. Really world renowned. And I sent it to him to ask him what he thought and if he could explain some of what was going on. And he's like, oh, I have this paper from 1975, and it's basically the quantum physics of light refraction. And, basically you've connected Parkinson's to the quantum physics of what's going on in the eye. And part of this, I know we've had a couple of discussions, Debbie, about something called the glycocalyx. And it turns out that the eye is one of the most sulfated polymer parts of the body. And it's also one of the earliest things that develops in embryology. And so, our Parkinson's paper in April is talking about damage to the glycocalyx in Parkinson's and this stiffening of this coating that is all over all our cells, the lining of our gut, lining of our blood vessels, lining of our brain. And it is one of those things that needs to be resilient. It is pulsing, it is sensing, it is delivering, it's bringing out the trash, it's letting in the nutrients. And in Parkinson's, what our paper is presenting is a hypothesis that it has gotten sort of stiffened and stuck in a particular position due to an imbalance between sodium and potassium.
Is the glycocalyx covering the nerves too, right?
Yeah. Well, you have a myelin sheath that covers those, and our paper also proposes that the myelin sheath is actually, partly glycocalyx.
Because that would make sense. So I was just reading towards the end of the book. Again, I don't want to give away too much, but what I was thinking about is how you looked at the why behind everything, as I love to do as well. But how you brought awareness to me, these organizations, nothing against them, but I've raised money and did team and training for a marathon. I was a coach for American Cancer Society, raising money we did a marathon. And how you start to think about all these foundations for different diseases, as Michael J. Fox Foundation has raised billions of dollars.
$2 billion. Yeah, $2 billion.
$2 billion. And this is what I kept thinking about this past week, is that if they're raising all that money, where is it going to? And what you brought to my attention is that they're looking at just treatment. No one's ever seems to be looking at how does this happen? And let's get to the root cause of it. And let's look at all the different things that go on, as with Parkinson's and, as you said, autism, all these different chronic diseases. It's like, right, are we figuring out not just a medication, but why is it even happening? None of this money seems to be going there. What have you learned?
Well, one of the main things I learned, and this is not just Parkinson's foundations, it's all disease foundations. They typically start out with a really good intent that they are going to cure something. But as they grow, as the money grows, it takes on a life of its own. And as I explain to people with Parkinson's, or really any chronic disease, you're the customer. You're the customer for the foundation because you provide the money that keeps them going. You're the customer for the researcher who has built a career looking at one tiny thing. So, you'll often find at the end of almost every researcher, more research is needed because they want to pitch the next grant that funds the lab. And so it becomes more about the money machine, just by virtue of the way things like that are organized and where the money comes from, which is also very often big food or big pharma that is looking for things that people have to do long term. So, they look not so a huge percentage of the Parkinson's research has been looking at drugs that can slow the progress rather than going all the way back downstream, because finding a cure would collapse all of these organizations. And so they're not necessarily in the business of putting themselves out of business by finding a cure. And then, a cure doesn't have a lot of money in it. Unless you charge a whole lot of money for the cure up front, you don't have something in perpetuity that you're getting out of it. So, and I say in the book, like, I don't think anybody is, nefariously, has a nefarious intent in what happens here. But even if I go back to, the very beginning of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, which was just a few years before John was diagnosed, he was talking about, we're going to find a cure in 10 years. But, he you end up with a board of establishment scientists, establishment people who are, thinking from the reductionist mindset, the way we have looked at things for decades that has not gotten us anywhere. And over time, that starts to shape the agenda of what you work on. And then when you become so big, whether it's American Heart or Michael J. Fox or something, what happens is all the little groups that were working on smaller, maybe more diverse initiatives, they start funneling their money up. And so they're bundling the money up to one institution that then controls all of the agenda. And so, it's kind of, to me, it reminds me of the microbiome. When you have lack of diversity, you have lack of positive outcome, because we need diversity in the research and the thinking about things. And when you have a centralized control, you're not going to have that resilience, that creativity, that broader perspective.
So what inspired you then to investigate the why instead of simply accepting the standard treatment model?
Well, I tell people, I think it really goes back to being trained as an auditor when I came out of school, which is never accept anything at face value, examine the evidence yourself. Mm-hmm. And the fact that, in my business career, I had been kind of a fixer and I solved problems for businesses, turned around their operations, made them work more efficiently. And so I took that mindset looking at Parkinson's, and I thought, this is a systems problem. We have to look at the whole. And so I just systematically started training myself, and I started with food and, worked through many, many fields of science. So, I have a very unusual background. I mean, I enjoy talking to you because we go down a lot of rabbit holes together, but you have to go down deeper and deeper and deeper into the rabbit holes. And I think teaching yourself actually is incredibly helpful in understanding the whole system, because you're trying to answer a question, you don't understand a term or a metabolic pathway or whatever it is, you have to go teach yourself. So you're following a logical path of self-education that also helps you retain that information better and be able to tie it to other things that you've learned, instead of just going through a textbook that somebody is teaching you, this is what a cell looks like. Well, not really. It's some cartoon that somebody's drawn of it. And so you're also not, I'll say, jaded by the dogma of the science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's important, because it's what I keep coming to is what you have done is looking at all the systems and it's not just one thing, it's all integrated. And as we say, to restore the body to metabolic harmony and get the body's innate intelligence to do what it's supposed to do, you found so many different pieces of the puzzle, what was off that contributed to having this disease, and kind of the connection of the gut and the brain isn't just the only thing as you got into. So what have you found with the gut brain connection, and how, led you into the world of microbiome research, how understanding how this evolved over time through your own research on Parkinson's?
Well, the gut brain connection is actually what led me to found a company. So I founded the BioCollective and started collecting people's fecal samples after I discovered the microbiome, and I discovered that from reading Martin Blazer's book, Missing Microbes, and I was able to sort of connect those pieces to John's history and exposure to antibiotics. And but then we start collecting samples. People in our lab say, oh, we can identify people with Parkinson's just by looking at their stool. It's like concrete compared to anybody else's. People with Parkinson's often experience severe chronic constipation 10 to 15 years prior to diagnosis. So, I start thinking, well, if we could address things like chronic constipation way ahead of the curve, and if doctors and people actually understood what that means, because it's waste sitting in the body recycling, and then your whole system has to continue, dealing with this toxic burden of waste. And then I started looking deeper and deeper, like, what are these toxins that the bacteria are producing? What do they do? Well, many of them are what are called pore forming toxins. They poke holes in our cells. They poke holes in the lining of the gut. So, we end up leaky all over the place, not just leaky gut, leaky cells. We're dumping potassium out into the system, and that's disrupting that connection to the brain, the circuitry that we need sodium to propagate. And early on, I found this researcher who's the father of something called microbial endocrinology. His name was Mark Lyte, Lyte, and he had shown that microbes are making these neurotransmitters. And I don't think people really understood that very well. And then he went on to partner with two scientists from University College Cork in Ireland, John Cryan and Ted Dinan. And and John and Ted wrote a book with Scott Anderson called The Psychobiotic Revolution. And they've done tons of research showing how, mood, stress, all of this feeds a metabolic profile that then selects for microbes that drive more neurotransmitters that create that additional stress. So you could get in this vicious loop from the microbes in the gut, um, you know, producing these triggers for you, or increasing catecholamines and the stress hormones and all of that. So, that was a huge epiphany for me too, because, dopamine, norepinephrine, they're also connected to microbes in the gut. So the microbes in the gut make dopamine, and that connected back to environmental assaults like glyphosate that is sprayed all over the place that kills the bacteria that make dopamine. And then, you have something like H. pylori in the gut that actually feeds on dopamine. So you have this whole disruption of the cycle that can tie back to glyphosate. And I tied that also back because for the 2 years prior to John's diagnosis, he was having a soy protein shake every day that he got from our neighbor who was selling for some multi-level marketing. God knows where it came from. But back in 2002, 98% of the soy was GMO and sprayed with glyphosate. And it's still pretty heavily that way. I mean, you can find some organic soy, but, I sort of question it in general.
Well, that's what it seems to be, more and more research and my own rabbit holes of what the bacteria, the good bacteria, certain strains, they're actually producing these products for us, these metabolites, and how you're saying they can influence inflammation, your immunity, metabolism, and the neurological health, and how fascinating it is to understand the role of the microbiome does so much more than we ever knew.
Well, I tell people now, we are more microbial than we are human.
Yeah.
In terms of cells, it's about 2 microbial cells to every 1 human cell. I mean, there's been some debate about that. But in terms of genes and functions, it's anywhere from 100 to 300 times more function from the microbiome. So if you're losing those microbes, you're losing a lot of function. And there's a researcher named Rodney Dieter and his wife Janice. They have a publication, I think it was back in 2012, maybe. It's called The Completed Human. And it's really about how, we are an ecosystem, and our microbiome is a big part of the finished and whole complete human. And if that doesn't take place properly from birth through the early years in life, it sets us up for longer term issues, many of which are mental health issues or things like Parkinson's, neurological, because, the B vitamins are made there, serotonin, dopamine, melatonin, like so many of these things are made by microbes in the gut. And understand that, when I really came to understand that, it was just a profound epiphany for me. And I had the chief scientific officer, Dr. Raul Cano, who had spent 35 years teaching microbial ecology at Cal Poly. And, we sat down and we were like, okay, well, these are ecological systems. We can build ecological systems to restore on the human side, which is what we do at BiotiQuest, and on the agricultural side, which is what Raul does now with Ancient Organics Bioscience in restoring the soil microbiome. And that's this other piece that is really missing from the conversation is, we're an interconnected ecosystem. Those two ecosystems meet inside us in the food we take in. They meet outside us on our skin and the contact with the environments that we come in contact with. And we're not as in relationship with nature as we used to be. So that's another contributor to our declining microbiome. And then all these chemicals we're using in industrial agriculture are killing the soil microbiome, much the way antibiotics are killing the human microbiome.
So you're finding there's all sorts of different reasons for Parkinson's onset. Is not just what I hear more about that you mentioned is dopamine related. So what have you, it's not a question I gave you, but what thoughts are if the microbiome or all these different players are involved in people getting Parkinson's, the difference of what is said now for Parkinson's? Do they have any kind of statement? This is how you get Parkinson's?
No, they're still really, and this is interesting. I was not able to attend because I had another conference that was in conflict, but they had the World Parkinson's Congress in Phoenix this year. I think they have it every 3 years. And some of the people I know who went said, well, they did talk about the microbiome, but they're like, we're not sure what to do about it, which is kind of amazing given the fact that there's now 2,500 published papers on Parkinson's and the microbiome. And I think there are some pretty interesting indicators where we could start to think about how to intervene and rebalance the ecosystem. But that's not how the medical system, medical training, or it's not designed to deal with the terrain and treating the terrain. One of the other, I would say, pretty profound and underappreciated, two underappreciated areas that I talk a bit about in the book are stress. Stress and the types of stress, because like most people, when they hear the word stress, they're like, oh, I have a terrible boss. They make me stressed, emotional stress. But there are all kinds of stressors. These chemicals are environmental stressors. John was a marathon runner. He finished the San Diego Marathon a few months before he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Training for endurance athletics. We've talked about this a bunch. That is stress on the body. Sleep stress. John was a search and rescue, Douglas County search and rescue. So when I wasn't traveling for work, he would often get called out in the middle of the night to go search for people in the mountains, in the woods, and be up all night with, headlights and stuff, digging through the woods. That's stressful. It's sleep disruption. Sleep is when our body takes out the trash and cleans things up. So that's a contributor. And then, I also talk about the spiritual aspects of feeling unworthy and how that can go back to things in our childhood, whether that's, like in some cases, like with John, we were never fully able to kind of peel back all of where that might have come from. But, John went to 12 years of Catholic school, and that's not to bash the Catholic faith. I love all my Catholic friends, but many of our religious institutions focus very much on how awful we are, how much we sin, how unworthy we are, and instead of on grace and the power of grace. And so that, I think, is an underappreciated thing. In the last 2 years, I worked on a docu-series called Voices of Parkinson's, and universally, in talking to people, there was a connection to some kind of emotional stressor, whether that was a loss of a job, loss of a child, loss of a parent, some kind of earth-shattering stressor, but also many people feeling like either they didn't have a voice, or uh, they didn't have agency in something. And so part of what I want people to start to think about and see is, the power of taking back your agency and working through some of the issues, what that might have in terms of improvement in your symptoms.
That was something I actually brought it up to my husband to have a conversation, because he grew up going to church, and his mother, who passed, as you know, from Parkinson's, and just asking him all these questions. Does she have this? Does she have that? But it's interesting growing up that way. If you mentioned your friend that said to John, "You are loved."
Mm-hmm.
And that brought on a good thought in my head as you're sharing, is that how many people just always focus on the negatives, that you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. That's why I have a sign in my pantry when we make coffee: positive attitude, positive vibes, positive energy. And I say that after my yoga practice when we stretch, is get ours. Positive thoughts, positive words, consistency of action, and believing in that power of one. As you know, you're also friends with Ben Azadi, who talks about the vitamin G and gratitude, but it's kind of goes together, this chronic stress and putting us down, how that, if it's childhood to from birth to today, that is another contributor to overfilling your beaker of stress.
Absolutely. And, just thinking back about John, a lot of things that we did, we were actively involved in different groups, and sometimes they would have a news story or what. And John used to joke about this, but it almost like became kind of a strange thing where they would take a picture, and then the only part of John that would be in the picture were his hands. And, it was like John's hands are in there, but John's not in there, and like not being seen. But another piece of that, you talk about words, is the power of words. And I don't know if I did talk about that in the book.
Yeah.
Like the words we say, and those words create pictures in our mind,
Mm-hmm.
and they bring to reality to us. Like words are, like when we were kids, they would say sticks and stones can hurt your bones, but words can never hurt. That is absolutely not true. Words have an incredible amount of power in the words that we say to ourselves. And I think the diagnosis of Parkinson's, and what a neurologist first says to someone, particularly when they say there's nothing you can do, there's no cure, it's progressive. Many people take on those words, and instead of, what John and I worked to do was come up with a different visual framework and different words to describe our future. And you have to work really hard to do that when somebody places words like that on top of you.
And I think that's an important part of, as you share that, why did this happen? That's why I love reading your book. And I actually read it the fastest I've ever read a book recently, because it's a story. It's a story of John. I feel that I know you better. I know him. I just know in the timeline. But you have these takeaways in each chapter. So it's a story, but blended with science and research. And it makes it so much easier to read and go, oh my gosh,
I
can
get
see.
it.
Yeah, I get it. And I hear your brain working, and knowing how you're always thinking deeper and looking at signs and how it comes together, but how you kind of shared what brain dumping and going into these phases is how it's easier to read and understand, hopefully to inspire other people that have family with Parkinson's. As we have Neil's mom, as I said, passed away, that you're looking at, okay, I don't want this to happen to me. What can I do? And as
What can I do?
focus on this platform, is what we can do today to be health optimizers to improve our future self. And that's why I think it's so important for people to read and know that you're this brilliant citizen scientist that's smarter than most doctors. How much
Thank you.
information you absorb. You're so amazing. This is impressive.
Well, I do have decided to put an appendix in the back of the book, and I call it a simple place to start. It's certainly not everything, but it does talk about at least some of these things to be mindful of, whether that's, our water, our food, exercise,
Yeah,
little
all of that.
different pieces, but trying also not to be obsessed with perfection.
Hmm.
And I think that's also something I've learned from being in the biohacking space. I mean, honestly, my story is biohacking before biohacking was a word, was trying to figure out what's going to help John, which is what biohacking is in a lot of ways. Um, but that sometimes people can get so obsessed with their stack, their protocol, the things that am I doing my weightlifting 3 times a week, or this, with these rigid schedules and attempting to control everything. And I put that in there so that people understand some of the things they can do and be more mindful. But what I say is part of the process of healing is learning to relax and surrender, and that you're not in control of everything. And, resilience and balance is it's that balance between pushing and rest. And, a type A person or somebody who runs marathons and does that type of endurance athletics often does not rest enough.
Which is what the show's all about, trying to get that message to others. So
Yeah,
it's perfect.
exactly. Yeah,
So going back to my questions, because I know we could talk for hours, but the Bio Collective, Sugar Shift, who did previous episodes on the research, what have you learned about the microbe patterns associated with the metabolic and neurological health, and how you created this for John? Just touch on that.
sure. So a lot of the evidence in Parkinson's now is showing, shifts in metabolism with, there are studies showing an archaeal species called Methanobrevibacter smithii. That's an organism that slows motility, so can help cause that constipation. It also um, sequesters copper, which is very important for signaling molecules for collagen synthesis in the body and supporting the glycocalyx, all of that. And um, Now I forgot what the question was. I got,
Well, just a connection of sugar shift, because you shared this
oh,
in the book. And I don't
yeah,
know if we did this on our podcast. We did about the sugar shift because I just had it this morning. I always think people should make this
yogurt.
themselves, but
Yeah.
the yogurt part of the sugar shift yogurt. But how is it related to the microbe that's in there that you created for John for his metabolic neurological health? What did you find the
So what
connection?
what the organisms are doing? So it was originally designed to convert some sugars, glucose and
Mannitol.
fructose, which we have too much in our diet, to mannitol, which is a free radical scavenger. So if people don't know what that is, it sort of puts out the fire of inflammation. Um, and we don't use it. It doesn't spike blood sugar, and it um, feeds a better profile of bacteria. And in that process, we did study it in a clinical trial, not in Parkinson's. We studied it in diabetes, but we found that it shifts the entire ecosystem back to an anaerobic state. So a low oxygen, which is what the gut's supposed to be. And when it does that, it supports the flourishing of things like bifidobacteria and some of the other keystone species that produce butyrate, which is a short chain fatty acid that feeds the lining of the gut and keeps that structure intact and strong. And also, by changing the gut back to an anaerobic state, it shifted it away from these endotoxin producing bacteria that make something called lipopolysaccharide. That is highly inflammatory, and it's implicated in Parkinson's, autism, Alzheimer's, chronic pain, uh, I mean, you name the disease, you can go find an LPS animal model that's using that to drive inflammation. And that was one of the biggest changes we saw, was a drop in those endotoxin producing bacteria that are implicated in inflammation. And then, Parkinson's is neuroinflammation, but you have all these other chronic diseases. It really depends on where the weakness in your body is and where that, those inflammatory uh, LPS goes. And so that was the biggest thing. But, one of the things I think with the yogurt, and this is also, you know, you hear people talk about probiotics and does it survive the gut? Well, that to me shows a real misunderstanding of what bacteria are and do, because, they have action all throughout their life cycle. So when they are alive and metabolically active, they are converting those, like in sugar shift, they are converting those sugars. When they die, so the bad bacteria, when they die, they leave that cell wall, which is that endotoxin. The good bacteria, when they die, they also have cell wall components, and many of those are called muramyl dipeptides. We know there's a peptide craze. So, microbes are the original peptide factories. So having the right microbes gives you the right peptides. And then everything that's there, all the things that they're producing, like butyrate and hydrogen, and, or they're converting things like acetaldehyde, they're doing all this complex chemistry, but their membranes are very active as well. And that's kind of a missing piece of the puzzle. So, you have the probiotic, the living working organism, and the postbiotic, which is everything that it made, plus its cell wall. And you have that, in a mixture, and also as it's moving through your body. But when you do the yogurts, you're going through multiple cycles of growth and die off. And so you have more of those muramyl dipeptide cell walls. They're also producing something called exopolysaccharides, which help with the mucin lining of the gut. So you get more of that in the yogurt. And you're getting, more of those other goodies of short chain fatty acids that it's making that help other microbes flourish and build a healthier microbiome.
So the connection, making the yogurt as we ferment it 100 degrees, 36 hours, which I just made some last night, that those bacteria, those are making their metabolites are making short chain fatty acids, those different bacteria strains. You're
Yep.
saying those are making butyrate,
Yep.
and then other metabolites they make as well?
Yes. So, and the bifidobacteria in particular, I think they're acetate producers, but acetate is also, feeding into the pipeline of different microbes that are butyrate producers
And
downstream.
then Dr. William Davis, who connected and promoted you in the Super Gut books, How I Found You, as the role of L-reuteri. Is that involved in this in Parkinson's research?
So I don't think anybody specifically has done Parkinson's research in it, but it's very interesting because the research has shown that L-reuteri increases oxytocin production. And oxytocin is the love hormone. It's that connection. I think it's also that feeling of worthiness. It's a real sense of well-being that we get from oxytocin, and that sits at the top of the hormone hierarchy. And so, sugar shift has an L-reuteri in it, and our cross-feeding data shows that the other organisms actually over an 8 to 12-hour period feed the reuteri so that the reuteri starts to grow more rapidly than the other organisms. So, I talk to people that either have the reuteri separately from Dr. Davis's L-reuteri strain or from sugar shift, and they will tell me like they feel oxytocin for the first time. And oxytocin is sort of the opposite of the what is the stress? Cortisol. It's the opposite of cortisol. And so, we're often stuck, and Parkinson's is often stuck in a hypercortisol state, which goes back to your adrenal fatigue. When we're in this hyper alert state all the time, which, marathon running is going to put you in a hyper alert state. But also being online all the time, and the dopamine hits and the things that we're getting from this overstimulation or the blue light, all of that is, putting us in this catecholamine state with, cortisol, as opposed to
cortisol's up, oxytocin's down.
Oxytocin's down, and you want oxytocin to be up and cortisol to be down.
So the next part is what you mentioned, our glycocalyx, which we did a podcast on. I did a couple solos on that. The connection, the glycocalyx, the gut barrier integrity, intestinal permeability, which we call leaky gut, and immune activation as pieces of that systems biology puzzle. How important is that for chronic diseases as Parkinson's to keep healthy?
Well, I mean, it's really important for everything in the human body because as Dr. Ninham's paper from 2025, I think it was January or February of 2025, is like endothelial surface layer glycocalyx is a universal nano infrastructure and alternate neural network. I mean, it's basically a major sensing organ in the body that has really been missed until very recently. And it's what's doing that sorting for us. It's letting in oxygen and nitrogen from our lung, the nanobubbles that are from the pulmonary surfactant in our lungs. It's letting out the carbon dioxide. It is allowing nutrients in and waste to come out. You know, it coats every cell. It's that single cell lining of our gut. It lines the blood-brain barrier. It's the sensory organ that lines the blood vessels and based on shear stress is producing nitric oxide and sensing and opening and closing those blood vessels. So it is, I think now probably the most underappreciated piece of our health. And that is where that flexibility, ability to adapt and restore is so, so critical. And, in Parkinson's, you start to see failures in that with, they often get orthostatic hypotension or low blood pressure. So that's an indication that there's problems in that endothelial surface layer in the vasculature. That also ties back to some of these hormones, aldosterone. And
well, that's adrenal test that we do in nutritional therapy was the blood pressure. When you get up, how much does it drop?
Yeah. So, the glycocalyx is this incredible sensory organ, but again, back to those endotoxins from the gram-negative bacteria, they can get stuck in the little fuzzy hair-like layers and, basically like clogging up a pipe, and it's unable to move and shape shift the way it needs to sense and sort.
So, side note again, I'll keep it short, but I did this mitochondria test last year and did my own lab investigation, ran some that GI map and some others. And looking at that, I had cell membrane damage and I had oxidative stress, and it was built up probably from years of my previous life of racing long distance Ironmans and marathons and all that stuff. So I'm curious if it's more, is it the cell membrane that's not fluid and it's too squishy, or is it the glycocalyx? How would you know?
Well, they're interconnected. So I'll say they're interconnected, but membrane flexibility is very, very critical. And the lipid structures that a membrane is made of are also very, very critical. And I just started a series in my Substack on lipids, and I apologize because it is the first part of it is really geeky science. But I think I'm releasing one this week on, the difference between omega-3, 6, and 9, and how fluid the membrane is, on a supplement called Fatty 15, on saturated fats, on all of these. This is actually some of the foundational work of Dr. Ninham that I've learned from him. And I don't know, I don't think I have the book within reach, but somebody else who sort of trained in his vein of, his tree of science. The book is called Life as a Matter of Fat. And it goes through all these different lipids, but it also explains how some of these chemicals can be altering our membranes, and antibiotics also, because many of the antibiotics are targeting bacterial membranes. Well, again, we're not that different than the microbes. And so, cell membrane damage can often be caused by these by antibiotics, by what are called quaternary ammonium compounds. I did a piece on that. Barry and I have a paper coming out on that ties back to his research from 1985, showing that it's immunosuppressive because that cell membrane and its ability to shape shift and be flexible, and the glycocalyx ability to sort and deliver nutrients. So a lot of what's been attributed to the cell membrane is actually happening in the glycocalyx. So there is kind of a interconnected system. But when you start to see that membrane damage, that is, back to these pore forming toxins from the pathogenic bacteria. It's the chemicals in the environment that damage the membranes. It's the different lipids like seed oils. When we have too much seed oil, the membrane gets stiffened. An omega-3 makes it like more flexible and squishy. So things like the brain octane. So I explain in the post the difference between the medium chain triglycerides and how they behave. So, somebody who's really interested in geeking out might be interested in that series. And I do promise as I get later in the series, I'm going to talk about a few more approachable things like, the egg, which, the egg yolks, of course, we were told for years, don't eat eggs, cholesterol's bad, blah, blah, blah. Well, the brain is mostly cholesterol, and cholesterol is a really interesting component of cell membranes. But, the egg, it has it all because it has to have everything in that egg to make a chicken. So it has to have the minerals, it has to have the membrane, raw materials, all of that. And so, an egg yolk is very important. But then we look at the difference between an egg that's raised under stress versus an egg that's raised, by your next door neighbor farmer, who's the chickens are running around in the field. And I like a book. It's an older book. I think it's called Pharmacology with an F. And it talks about, the differences in some of our food. It even has a chapter on the difference between eggs raised in these stressful environments. And, so we know that stress impacts us. It impacts our membranes. It's going to impact that egg as well.
Funny. Well, I'll have to read that because I was just recording, started a series myself on signals and nutritional therapy for the vagus nerve and talking about cell membrane health and all that together too, but just how we need that omega-3 fats and talking about the fatty 15 and all the connection to the nutrients we need to give the body the building blocks to do what it needs to do, and how much of that we don't get because we don't eat the food that we should, or we might eat healthy, but we're not digesting it, breaking it down in connection of the vagus nerve.
Yes, and also I would say, our food supply is not as nutriently dense as it used to be, and that's in part due to the widespread use of glyphosate because it is ubiquitous in our environment and it binds minerals. And, we're eating food to get minerals, which are the raw materials of the structures of our body.
Mm-hmm. Well, that goes into the next question. You kind of answered most of it, but environmental and lifestyle influences as chronic stress, nutrition, exercise, recovery, and other exposures that may contribute to long-term disease risk. What would you add to that we haven't talked about?
I mean, really, kind of going back to my early research with John and the soy, glyphosate, I just put out a piece yesterday called Lights Out. Also, it's a little bit geeky because it talks about something called the shikimate pathway. But that pathway is, so there are 3 amino acids that we do not make ourselves. We have to get from our food. They're made in plants or they're made by bacteria in our gut, and that's tyrosine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine. And those are disrupted by glyphosate because the target of glyphosate is the shikimate pathway where those are made. And I went through and wrote the whole article explaining, the science between how this pathway works and then what downstream metabolites come from phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan, and the connection to disrupted sleep or increased stress, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and the connection to all of these pieces that tie back to those 3 amino acids and glyphosate, breaking that. And so at the end, I was like, well, I'm just going to ask, a bunch of different AIs, like can life on Earth exist without the shikimate pathway working properly? And essentially, they all came back and said no, except for Perplexity said, well, yes, some organisms could survive, but life on Earth as we know it would not survive. And so I think it is some geeky science, but the whole argument over glyphosate is still not looking at it from a systems perspective.
Mhm.
And, it takes the minerals out, it messes with these amino acids, which carry light. They are the light carrying molecules. And it also is a dehydrator. And we have lots of problems with, hydration in the body. And
Mhm.
so I just think there are like much more system-wide problems with organophosphates, which glyphosate is an organophosphate. There are many organophosphates, and they are in our water. They're in the air, they're in the rain. Stephanie Seneff has shown that. And I would say if you look at this study from back in 2014, I really wish they would update it, but they show the increase in GMO corn and soy and the increase in the use of glyphosate back through 2014. And they map it on top of about 20 different chronic diseases. And it's shocking to look at the charts. But that was even before they started using glyphosate and organophosphates to dry down other foods. So all of your beans, your grains, all of those, they use at the end of harvest to dry the crops faster. And, what I have noticed recently is if I'm making something like lentils and I want to soak them for a couple of days and see if they will sprout, I have not been able to get lentils to sprout for well over a year. And I know a farming consultant in Canada where a lot of the lentils are grown who actually told me that, none of them have any nutrients in them.
Whoa, that's interesting.
So shocking. I mean, I haven't taken it somewhere and tested it,
Yeah.
but he's basically telling me that the clay soils up there have accumulated the glyphosate such that, there's not enough nutrient uptake in the plant to
Wow.
um, have nutritional value,
Hmm.
empty calories. And so no wonder we keep craving food because our
Yeah,
body knows that we don't have the
need it.
nutrients.
Yeah, interesting. So, what other lessons that apply beyond Parkinson's helping us understand how to recognize the patterns earlier to help support our quality of life, how we age, being resilient is my word of the year. What are some major lessons?
Breathe, like
Hmm.
really pay attention to how you breathe. I mean, it's something I have to remind myself all the time. And like today, I'm doing 5 podcasts in a row, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm not really breathing deeply because I'm constantly
Stress.
talking or whatever. It's like breathing is such an important signal to our brain or
Hmm.
heart, that coherence of the heart and the brain through slow rhythmic breathing to send a signal that I'm okay. Shutting your eyes. And we had this really amazing epiphany yesterday. We're doing a little study in Parkinson's using the sugar shift, bean minerals, and a product called Revasca for the glycocalyx. And we're doing this test with a glycocheck, which is a camera under the tongue to look at the microvasculature. And one of the women in the study yesterday, she couldn't hold the camera because her hand was tremoring. And Pam, who runs the machine, she said, try closing your eyes. And as soon as she closed her eyes, the tremor stopped. So I think it's like the system is on overload. Let's just let it rest. And, um, rest is just so underappreciated. We feel like we've got to be contributing all the time and, doing something. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just sit and breathe and relax and appreciate and be grateful.
Hmm. That's exactly what I've been diving into, of course, is just giving our body the safety signal. And more I do research and correlating what I see in people's metabolism testing, the lab testing, and people not getting results when people give them all these medications and supplements. we're not looking at the root cause. And I'm finding it more and more is that conference on mitochondria, cell danger response, and how our body's in that sympathetic dominance, how we are in that sense of survival mode and everything's in conservation mode. And just teaching us how order of operations before we can start to repair anything. We often just need to give the right signal of safety. You are loved, you are safe, you're okay. But I feel that everything will backfire if we don't start here first and giving that right signal of safety.
That I think that's probably one of the most profound takeaways. And it's also, kind of goes back to that trying to do biohacking. And one of the things that I learned with John, particularly after COVID, is putting in these artificial signals from different electrolytes and different things was actually swinging him dramatically. His ability to hold that homeostatic balance, that bandwidth had become very, very narrow after COVID. And, really working on how can we, I think a lot of it is mental state to feel safe. And part of that is not trying to overload all of these other solutions until we can truly feel that safety in our body. Because otherwise, we're throwing in more signals in a body that already has static. I think I have a chapter in the book where I talk a little bit about the static in this part of the back part of the brain, which is also where the reptilian brain is, but it's also known as the mouth of God. And I think that is where that signal of safety and worthiness and all of that comes into the body. And when it's tightened up and on overload, we're not getting that. And, we can't do anything with those nutrients we're putting in.
That's exactly what I've been diving into the last few months and trying to share that on all these different podcasts, solo episodes, because I'm seeing this with clients when I do my investigation, when I listen, when I read things, like we are adding all this stuff in that's not going to make impact. You have to teach the body how to feel safe first. So I know we're out of time, but I wanted to just kind of summarize when people read the book, how many, you don't have to list them all, but the systems involved in the Parkinson's, for John's example of, LPS, trauma, COVID, virus in Australia. How many things do you think can be added up?
I mean, yeah, we didn't really get into John's early life, but, in his first 4 years of life, he had a symptom profile that was very similar to a inborn error of metabolism called PKU. His genetics did show some loss of function in phenylalanine production. He also grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, in the 60s and 70s. Toxic air, toxic water, just a toxic environment. He worked on a golf course throughout high school and college, and we now have evidence that people who live within a mile of a golf course have an increased risk of Parkinson's because lots of herbicides and pesticides are used on golf courses. He worked for a manometer company when he was in college, and that exposed him to mercury. Plus, there was a lot of mercury in the air pollution in Cleveland. He did have a high mercury load, and that's something that we dealt with pretty early on in the disease. He after college, he was in sales in Odessa, Texas, in oil field. He was going out on the oil rigs selling to people on the oil rigs, so exposure to a lot of hydrocarbons. And then, I talk in the book about just general stressors of our life where you think you're just like going through life and you're getting along. But as I wrote the book and looked back over it, I was like, okay, this was like we were just stacking stressors on top of each other. And you're thinking, oh, that's just life. But you've got to do that training back to a restful state. And if you're constantly stacking stressors and not going to that restful state, I think that's one of the big, big, big ones.
Well, I think to summarize, the book really shows that there's not just one thing that causes Parkinson's. It's not just your genetic. And that you did a huge, long, deep dive into John's reasons. And I don't even know if you really figured out if he passed away from Parkinson's or was it
Oh,
Had,
he had a pulmonary embolism,
yeah, but it's not
but that pulmonary
Parkinson's.
embolism goes back to the glycocalyx and the cardiovascular damage done from COVID on top of an already compromised glycocalyx in the Parkinson's profile. And this, we're swimming in air. We didn't talk about nanobubbles or gas, and that's been ignored in most of the science. But essentially, people know about getting the bends from coming up too fast from scuba diving. Well, the day that John had his pulmonary embolism was the day before Hurricane Helene made landfall, and it was the largest drop in barometric pressure in recorded history. So that's sending a signal to that compromised glycocalyx and causing a large, basically nucleation of air bubbles and creating a pulmonary embolism and an air-water interface that.
Hmm. So it goes with what I keep talking about again, is the signals. What signals is our body giving us? What signals are we sending our body? And so in middle age, to improve our future selves so we can thrive as we age and not struggle, I think it's taking that ownership today, not waiting till you have red flags, understand
Right.
what you can do. You have a great appendix of how to get started, simple place to start. I think they're great suggestions in the back of the book, but it's really, that is not just one thing. Parkinson's, other diseases, as other autism, other dementia. Parkinson's is part of that, but Alzheimer's, all these different brain related diseases, I think I and many people are afraid of as you get older, and how to prevent it. But it's not just one thing, but it's all the systems work together. We need to restore metabolic harmony and keep doing that as you age to thrive. Is how would you summarize it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, we're an ecosystem. We have to learn to treat ourselves as an ecosystem and, you know, balance that, because you can have a long and flourishing. I mean, Dr. Ninham is 90 years old. I mean, and he's going, he's still going like crazy. So, vitality doesn't necessarily mean that you're, the most fit looking person. Uh, it may be more that you're the most balanced person and the
Mm-hmm.
most resilient person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of people will find a lot of clues that they can put together for their own personal story and journey to understand, oh, well, that may have had an impact, and here's how I might think about, mitigating any future risk of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I hope that people come out of it with some actionable things and not afraid, but very hopeful that there's a lot we can do to change the trajectory of our health.
Yes. And that's kind of what my mission is for my own business, is focusing on creating your future you blueprint. I call it doing what you can do now. I have a high school friend that's doing that with me now. His dad just is still alive, but struggling with dementia and different things going on, that he's like, I don't want that to happen. And so he's taking action today to figure out, what can I do to improve my deep sleep? What can I do to improve my health so I can not be what's happening to my father? And I think that's in middle age, when you start to see what's happening to your parents, it's a little more, as for myself, a little more motivating to go, oh my gosh,
Oh, yeah.
let's do what we can do today. So I thank you so much. Where can people learn more? Well, I mean,
So
first,
also, I think if they haven't sent it to you, I will have them send it to you. We have a book bonus for anybody who buys the book. There's a website, our BiotiQuest has a page on the book, and you can go and register there. And we have an Ask Me Anything at the end of July that people can come to. They will also get I think, a free PDF download of my Perfect Poof book. And there's that simple place to start. I did a little bit more detail in a PDF download, so you can get all of those if you go to that website, which I'll send you. You can find me on biotiquest.com. That's biotiquest.com. And that's where our probiotics are. But I write a blog there that connects a lot of these dots. And we also have a YouTube channel at BiotiQuest where all of my learning lab calls and I do a book club there also, and many of my podcasts, so you can get other bits and pieces of the conversation about how I came to understand these things on those. And we're also on Instagram, so follow us on Instagram at BiotiQuest. And then if you really want to geek out on the science, you can go to my Substack, Martha's Quest.
I will do that. That's me. All right, girl. Well, hopefully we can see you soon, and maybe we can host an event at our house and promoting the book this fall or next time.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah. When I get back from Australia, I'm going to Australia for a month.
That's right. All right. Thanks so much. You are amazing, and keep it up.
Thank you, Debbie. You're amazing too.
Thanks for listening to the Coach Debbie Pot Show. If today's episode sparked a light bulb moment, that's your sign to stop guessing and start building your personalized future you blueprint. You can learn more or book a discovery call at www.debbiepotts.net. Be sure to follow the show on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search Coach Debbie Potts. 2 T's. If this episode helped you, please subscribe, rate, and review. It's how we help more people age with strength, energy, and clarity. Until next time, remember, age is inevitable. How you age is not.